Okay, so the last we talked about is they put a mirror in a pizza box, and then they stuck a pigeon, and Summer took the mirror and they stuck it with super glue, I guess, on the bottom of one of the tables in the Sweet Tooth Candy ice cream shop, whatever it's called. And now Nate and Trevor have gone through the reflection world and into the dining area of the shop, and they have just dropped into the ice cream place. And that's where we left off. Are you ready? Okay. You don't see anybody of a sign of anybody, just our moms trying to break in and steal fudge, Trevor said. Nate chuckled. It looks quiet and dark, Trevor continued. I think the only light was trickling in through the windows from the streets. Then go for it, Nate said. Trevor pulled a mint from his pocket and put it in his mouth. The circle became elastic, like he was on a trampoline. Biting down, he instantly dropped through the circle to the tile floor. Raising his arms over his head, Trevor ducked down, worming the rest of himself through the round opening. There was not much room to spare, but he fit. He scooted out of the way so Nate could drop through. Trevor had almost forgotten that he was holding his flashlight until he saw it actually penetrating the darkness of the candy shop. The beam landed on a withered old man wearing a long feathered headdress, making Trevor feel a brief surge of panic before he recognized the figure as the wooden Indian. He switched the light off, sneakers slapped down against the tile floor as Nate dropped through the mirror. To Trevor, it looked like a moment from a magic show, a pair of legs wearing jeans sticking out from the bottom of the table with nothing visible above it. It would make a pretty good stage trick. Nate shimmied the rest of the way through the mirror, then crab walked out from under the table. I can hardly see, Nate whispered so quietly that Trevor could barely hear him. Should I turn on the flashlight? Trevor whispered back. Better than stumbling and making a ton of noise, Nate said. Trevor clicked on the light. After how busy the candy shop had been lately, it was peculiar to see it empty. Nobody behind the counter, no patrons, everyone still and silent, with candy everywhere for the taking. Where should we look first? Trevor asked. In the back, Nate said. Let's try the table where Mrs. White always sits. After ducking under the hinged segment of the counter, they went through the batwing doors into the rear of the store. The tables were messy, covered with various candy projects in different stages of development. On one table was an oily black snake coiled in a cage. Another rested a fancy jade urn. On a third slouched a sack of spilling burgundy powder. Trevor shone the flashlight beam onto the table with the purple tablecloth. Nate hurried over, knelt, and lifted the tablecloth to look underneath. Nothing, Nate growled. Not so loud, Trevor reminded him. The two of them meticulously navigated the room. The flashlight beam slowly swept the shelves and work tables. They checked inside crates, boxes, barrels, and jars. They looked inside a spacious closet, a cramped restroom, and behind a door marked private that led to a long staircase. They even investigated the cage with the snake. I wouldn't do that. What now? Nate asked in frustration after a final cupboard yielded no telescope. What's upstairs? Trevor asked. It's probably where Mrs. White lives, Nate said. Do we dare? Trevor asked. If the telescope isn't down there, it's probably up there, Nate. Trevor sighed. After we leave, we'll have no more mirror mints. This is our only shot at this. Keep those shock bits handy. Nate followed Trevor over to the door with the black and gold private sign. They opened it, and Trevor shone his flashlight up the long staircase. Treading lightly, they took the stairs one at a time, tense, ready to retreat if necessary. A couple of times a step creaked and they paused, waiting, listening, trying not to breathe. At last they reached the top of the stairway and found a plain brown door with a peephole. Trevor placed a hand on the doorknob and slowly turned it. It's open. It's open, he mouthed to Nate with wide eyes. Nate motioned for him to open it further. Switching the flashlight off, Trevor eased the door open. The room beyond was dark. Stepping through the doorway, Trevor felt thick carpeting beneath his feet. Nate slipped in behind him. They left the door ajar. Trevor held up a hand for Nate to wait. He could hear the sound of something large breathing. He moved his mouth and Nate's ear and whispered, "You hear that?" "Yes," Nate whispered back. Trevor cupped a hand over the end of the flashlight and turned it on. His red fingers glowed, and just enough light escaped to reveal the big, round man lying sideways on the couch, mouth gaping, heavy chest rising and falling rhythmically, huge head cushioned on his fleshy arm. He wore a white undershirt and a blue knit blanket covered him. The room was large, with 2 couches, 2 armchairs, an entertainment center, and several bookcases crowded with old books and glass figurines. The entrance to the hallway yawned at one end of the room. Trevor crept away from the hallway, passing the couch, moving into the adjoining dining room and kitchen. He scanned the china cabinet and the tidy counters. A pocket door in the dining room was shut. Trevor pushed the door sideways and it slid into the wall, revealing a roomy study designed around an impressive wooden desk. Trevor uncovered the end of the flashlight, allowing the beam to shine brightly. Nate pointed at the desk. Trevor saw the pocket watch resting alongside a leather-bound copy of The Collected Reflections of Hanover Mills. "She took the book," Nate whispered. "Still no telescope," Trevor replied. Nate tiptoed into the room and tried the desk drawer, sliding them open and closed with extraordinary care. When he opened the third one, he froze, then pulled out the telescope, pumping his fist in silent triumph. Trevor motioned for them to go. Once again, dimming the flashlight with his hand, Nate picked up the book as well, following Trevor back into the dining room. The instant Nate passed through the doorway, a blast of sound like 100 trumpets blared for a solid 3 seconds. The unexpected clamor startled Trevor so much that he dropped his flashlight. Crouching to retrieve it, he saw that Nate had dropped the book, which Trevor grabbed as well. Their ears ringing from the explosion of sound, Trevor and Nate hurried toward the front room, but stopped short when they found the big round man on his feet, facing them, his hair matted and disheveled. He had just turned on a lamp in his undershirt and athletic shorts. His tremendous girth was on display. From this rotund torso to his elephantine limbs, blubber deformed his body. He was tall, a few inches beyond 6 feet, and nearly as wide, an obese hill of man with a grouchy head on top. "This isn't what it looks like," Nate said. The big man opened his mouth with thick, slimy lips spreading wide, as if to take a bite from the towering sandwich. His chest convulsed, and out shot an orange glob of jelly nearly the size of grapefruit. The glistening projectile splattered against Trevor's shoulders. About half of it continued past him to slap the wall. The orange ooze on his shoulder writhed shapelessly, climbing towards his neck, moving like an amoeba. Shouting, Trevor wiped at the nightmare spitball, orange jelly squishing between his fingers. The man fired another orange glob of similar size at Nate, who avoided it by diving behind the dining room table. Having wiped away most of the ooze, Trevor joined Nate behind the table, fumbling in his pocket for the frostbites. Nate was also digging in his pocket. Mouth still gaping, the big man walked towards them. Instead of expelling another glob of ooze, he sent a vast quantity of orange jelly gushing from his mouth, like water from a fire hose. The stream of jelly collected on the table in a vivid, translucent mound, enough orange ooze to overflow a bathtub. The gooey pile quivered, stretched taller, then surged off the table, enveloping Nate. Trevor scrambled away from the table back into the study, tearing open the baggie with his frostbites inside. Nate looked like he was drowning in orange gelatin. Only his head and one arm remained outside the rippling ooze. The big man was approaching the table, looking considerably thinner, loose skin sagging, orange jelly no longer pouring from his lips. Trevor popped 2 shock bits into his mouth. It was his first time sampling the candy. They tasted like vanilla yogurt. For a moment he felt an intense chill sweep over him, and then his body went numb. The translucent gelatin now totally surrounded Nate. Trevor saw his encased friend move one hand to his mouth, followed instantly by a bright flash. The electrical burst liquefied the jelly, which slopped all around him to form a dull orange peel. Placing his palm to his mouth again, Nate arose, sparks crackling between his fingers. The pool of liquefied jelly began to flow towards the big man, who stayed on the far side of the table from Nate. "Run to the kitchen," Nate called, charging the big man. Nate retreated to the kitchen, dodged around the counter. The big man backpedaled into the front room. As Trevor neared the liquefied pool, it froze solid, taking on a frosted sheen. The big man opened his mouth and coughed a jelly ball at Trevor. The sphere struck him in the chest and sent him spinning to the ground. His numbness prevented him from feeling the pain, but he heard his rib snap. It took Trevor a moment to realize that the coldness had frozen the jelly ball, causing it to bash him instead of splatter. As the big man inhaled to launch another jelly ball, Trevor spat out his frost bits. Instantly, the numbness vanished and the sharp pain blossomed in the front side of his chest. The next jelly ball splattered against his forearm, soaking his hair. "Nate!" Trevor called, crawling away as the big man advanced. Another jelly ball slapped wetly against his back. The gelatin on his head squirting against his scalp. Nate raced out of the kitchen, arms raised threateningly. Electricity sparked from his fingertips. The big man faced Nate and spat out the glob of jelly the size of a golf ball. There was a flash as the glob struck Nate, and the tiny ball turned to liquid. "He's shorting out my charge," Nate yelled, slapping more shock bits into his mouth, just in time for another undersized jelly ball to waste his electricity. I don't have many shock bits left." Trevor was now crawling on slick frozen ooze. It vibrated beneath his hands and knees. Having spat out the frost bites, he could feel that the temperature in the apartment had lowered significantly. His breath visibly condensed in front of his face. What was his weapons? He had moon rocks, a couple of mirror mints, some shock bits, and his frostbites. "I can do frostbites," Trevor warned, reaching for his shock bits. Those balls of goo turned hard as rock. "I dropped the scope," Nate said. "Snag it." Glancing under the table, Trevor could see the telescope lying on the far side. where the jelly had enveloped Nate. Trevor lunged under the table, sprawling on frozen ooze, ribs aching, and grabbed it. Surrender now, and we may show you leniency, the big man said, cheeks drooping, baggy skin sagging from his bare arms and legs. He was considerably less rotund. Nate stood with a handful of shock bits ready. I'll eat these the second before I touch him, Nate said. Follow me. Trevor was back on his feet, telescope in hand. Nate rushed the big guy, who ran right at him, vomiting a blinding stream of orange jelly. Before Nate could get the shock bits into his mouth, the big guy caught hold of his wrist, continuing to expel ooze from his mouth. Pulsating gelatin cocooned Nate for the second time. Trevor ran at them, telescope in one hand, shock bits in the other. The instant before he reached them, Trevor slapped the shock bits into his mouth and sprang. His outstretched hand touched the gelatin, and with the flash of lightning, the ooze liquefied. The big man was tumbling, and Nate was hurled into the wall. Ribs smarting, Trevor got another dose of shock bits ready and approached the big man, who was shakily rising, his body grotesquely deflated, a skeleton wearing skin 10 sizes too big. Orange liquid ran towards the freakish man along the floor, as if the apartment were tilted in his direction. Just before reaching him, Trevor ate more shock bits, a larger dose than he had ever tried, and swatted the man on the shoulder. A blazing flash and a crack like a gunshot sent the man soaring into the entertainment unit, shattering DVDs and overturning the television. Nate was on his feet and running for the front door. Trevor followed him, his last dose of shock bits ready in his palm. Hold it, ordered the voice that sounded like it had inhaled helium. Trevor turned and saw the blond dwarf with the flat top crouched in the middle of the hall that led away from the front room. Hands balled into fists, he wore a dark blue tank top and gray sweatpants. A white glimmer flashed about him, gradually intensifying. He had a look on his face like he was trying to lay an egg. Since the dwarf was not moving, Trevor was almost to the door. He refrained from eating his final dose of shock bits. The dwarf sprang streaking toward Trevor as if he had been shot from a cannon, slamming into him with stunning force. Searing pain erupted in Trevor's ribs. The telescope flew out of Trevor's hands, as did the shock bits, and he crashed to the ground with the dwarf's strong arms wrapped around his torso. The telescope rolled forward across the carpeting. Standing in the doorway, Nate picked it up. Run! Trevor gasped. Nate shoved a handful of shock bits into his mouth, and a glob of orange jelly splashed into his, accompanied by a flash. That's all I have, Nate cried. Run, Trevor repeated, clinging to the dwarf, trying to give Nate a chance. Nate disappeared from the doorway. Trevor heard his feet thumping down the stairs. The feisty dwarf wrenched himself free and chased after him. The big man scrambled over and collapsed onto Trevor, blanketing him with his mushy, loose skin. The man seized Trevor's waist, pinning him to the ground at either side of his head. Your luck just ran out, the big man said. His breath reminded Trevor of a rotten jack-o'-lantern his family had once kept on the porch too long. Trevor buckled and struggled, but even deflated, the big man was too strong. Orange liquid began to slither over Trevor, warm and syrupy. The liquid streamed up the big man's arms and followed into his gaping mouth. Trevor closed his eyes. Trevor, 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 said a familiar grandmotherly voice, tingled with regret. I could not be more disappointed. Trevor opened his eyes. Mrs. White stood above him, wearing a lavender robe with lace embellishing the neck. She shook her head sadly. I had so hoped to spare you from the horror of my dark side. So we now know what that one guy can do. That's why he's so big. He's just full of that orange gelatin. Yikes. But what's going to happen to Trevor now that Miss White has him? And does Nate get away? You'll find out in the next chapter called Costly Clues. Dun, dun, dun.